I was standing alone in the quiet of my Springfield kitchen, the clock ticking toward midnight, when my phone buzzed with a message that would end 17 years of marriage in less than 20 words. I've met someone better. I'm not coming back. Your things are already in storage. Attached was a screenshot of our joint bank account, over $120,000 transferred out just like that. No conversation, no warning, just numbers and silence. I didn't throw the phone, I didn't scream. Instead, I set it down on the counter and stared at my reflection in the window above the sink, wondering when exactly the woman I married had become a stranger. The signs had been there. Weekend trips that kept getting longer, hushed phone calls that ended the second I walked in, a new distance in her voice that I'd tried to write off as stress. But I had seen it all. I just chose not to believe it. Retired now, but trained as a forensic auditor, I'd built a career spotting discrepancies others missed, irregularities buried deep in balance sheets and off-the-books accounts. What I never imagined was that one day I'd have to apply those same instincts to the collapse of my own life. I poured myself another cup of black coffee, then walked into my study, sat down at my old laptop, and opened a financial system no one, not even my wife, knew existed. I typed a single phrase I hadn't used in years, one I'd hoped I'd never need. Activate contingency. My name is Raymond Whitaker. I'm 58 years old, and until last night I believed I had a stable, if not entirely exciting life. I live, or used to live, in a quiet suburb of Springfield, Missouri, where the pace is slow. The neighbors mostly mind their own business, and life doesn't throw many surprises unless you go looking for them. I never did. After 2 decades working as a forensic auditor for federal agencies and private firms, I retired early, not because I had to, but because I wanted to slow down, reclaim a little peace, maybe restore the old farmhouse I inherited from my grandfather. I'd spent years untangling other people's fraud, watching powerful men fall because of the small details they thought no one would catch. And yet, I'd failed to see what was unraveling right in front of me. My wife, Vanessa, was once the bright center of my world. I met her at a benefit gala hosted by a veterans outreach organization. She was volunteering at the check-in table, all smiles and spark, and I, still a little cautious after a short-lived first marriage, was drawn to her energy in spite of myself. She worked in wellness and holistic health, full of optimism and dreams of opening her own yoga studio. I admired her passion, even if I didn't fully understand it. Within a year, we were married. I invested in her studio with the same care and trust I gave my own work, quietly, completely. When she asked for a second location downtown, I didn't hesitate. When she wanted a larger house, luxury retreats, new cars, and designer gear, I signed the checks without question, believing we were building something together, even if our lives were starting to drift in different directions. In hindsight, there were warning signs, too many. Her growing obsession with image, the way she'd excuse herself to take calls that never seemed urgent, the way her girls' weekends became longer and more frequent, each one accompanied by new outfits I'd never see her wear again. She began to speak of the studio as hers, as if I hadn't funded every inch of it. Her social media presence ballooned almost overnight, full of curated wellness quotes, gym selfies, and filtered smiles. I wasn't in any of them. But I said nothing, and maybe I didn't want to confront what I already suspected. Or maybe I held on to the belief that loyalty meant letting people evolve, even if they changed in ways you no longer recognized. I told myself the distance was temporary, that her stress would pass, that this was just a phase of midlife rediscovery. What I didn't realize was that she'd already begun building an exit, one account transfer at a time. 6 years ago, while helping my mother settle an estate dispute, I quietly began reorganizing my own finances. I created holding companies, shifted assets into protected trusts, and set up offshore investment channels for my international clients, all legal, all discreet. Vanessa knew about our joint savings and checking accounts, but the rest, I kept off the radar, not out of paranoia, but habit. I've spent a lifetime chasing financial shadows. I've learned the value of keeping certain doors locked until absolutely necessary. Now looking back, I realize how deliberate it all was. The smile when I agreed to fund her latest project, the carefully timed affection, the way she brushed off any question about money with that practiced phrase, "You handle all that, Ray, I trust you." But trust, I've learned, means nothing when it's only flowing one way. And so when her text came cold, calculated, and final, I didn't fall apart. I activated what I had built quietly, beneath the surface of our marriage, a plan to protect what was mine. Because while she had been preparing to leave, I had been preparing to survive. In the months leading up to that message, there had been a shift. Subtle at first, almost imperceptible if you weren't paying attention. But I was. It started with the small things. Business trips that stretched into unplanned retreats, phone calls she'd taken the guest room with the door closed, and new clothes that never seemed to appear in our home closet, only on her social media. Vanessa began spending more time with a new circle of friends she met through her wellness studio. Young, fit, endlessly positive people who thrived on detox smoothies and branded mantras. She called them her tribe. I called them unfamiliar. She said I wouldn't enjoy their conversations, and it's just yoga and business talk, Ray. She'd smiled dismissively as she packed for another weekend at a so-called silent retreat in Santa Fe. I didn't argue. After years of marriage, I had learned which questions would be answered and which would only bring silence or sighs. But I watched, and I remembered. One Sunday morning, while she was still away, I opened our joint banking app and saw a series of withdrawals, $800 here, $1,200 there, marked for wellness marketing services and consulting fees to names I didn't recognize. None of them raised red flags alone, but together they painted a quiet pattern. Money was leaving, and it wasn't coming back. I checked her personal account, which she often claimed had just a little fun money, and found it steadily growing while ours was being quietly drained. Still, I said nothing. I suppose part of me hoped that by pretending not to see the cracks, they wouldn't widen. Or maybe I didn't want to admit, even to myself, that the woman who once laid her head on my shoulder every night now saw me as little more than an ATM with a wedding band. Her affection had become selective, offered only when she needed something signed, paid for, or endorsed. And I gave in every time because I remembered who she used to be. And I wasn't ready to believe she was gone, but the emotional distance wasn't just growing, it was becoming structural. She missed our anniversary with the excuse of a last-minute conference in San Diego. I found out later, through a tagged photo, that she had been at a luxury spa in Napa, sipping champagne in a robe while I reheated leftovers alone. When I brought it up gently, she apologized by buying me a leather briefcase I never asked for and said, "I've been so overwhelmed, Ray. I didn't mean to hurt you." That night, while she slept beside me, I finalized updates to my contingency plan. I think the worst part wasn't the betrayal itself, it was the performance. The way she could still smile at me across the dinner table as if nothing had changed, still kiss my cheek before heading out the door to meet a supplier, knowing full well she was already planning her exit. She was good at it, too, almost professional. And maybe that's because she wasn't just lying to me anymore. She was living a new story altogether, one where I no longer had a place. Still, I stayed quiet, playing the role of the oblivious husband, but beneath that silence was movement, controlled, deliberate, precise. I updated all my digital access points, rerouted notifications, and activated dormant financial tools I'd built years ago, long before I ever needed them. I didn't confront her because confrontation would only tip my hand. And this wasn't about vengeance, not yet. It was about staying ahead of a woman who had turned her back on me long before she sent that final message. The storm had been gathering for years. She just didn't realize that while she was planning her freedom, I had already begun to prepare my defense. The morning after her message, I didn't wake up with rage or heartbreak surging through me, the way you'd expect from a man who had just been discarded like an outdated appliance. Instead, I got up at my usual hour, brewed my coffee with the same careful rhythm I had followed every morning for years, and sat in the chair by the window, letting the silence wrap itself around me. The rituals of routine have a strange way of softening the blow, even as the weight of reality settles in your chest like a stone. There's a particular kind of hurt that doesn't come from raised voices or betrayal shouted in a moment of passion. It's the quiet kind, the kind that arrives with a notification, a digital theft, a hollow sentence typed out without flinching. Vanessa hadn't left during a fight or even a conversation. She'd slipped out like a thief in the night, leaving behind no argument, no remorse, only a vacuum where trust used to live. As I stared into that stillness, I didn't feel defeated. I felt something colder, more enduring. Clarity. This wasn't just about the money, though the 6 figures she'd swept away in a single transaction would be enough to gut most people. It wasn't even about the fact that she had packed my belongings into storage as if I were some ex-tenant being evicted without notice. No, what stayed with me, what embedded itself under my skin like a splinter, was the realization that everything we'd shared had meant so little to her that she could erase it all with the press of a button. I opened my laptop and logged into the financial infrastructure I had quietly developed over the past several years, a system originally intended to protect high-risk clients during asset disputes, but which I had adapted for personal use when the cracks in my marriage began to deepen. The dashboard lit up, crisp and clean, ready for the protocol I never thought I'd need to execute. With a few keystrokes, I froze all our joint accounts, canceled shared credit cards, and flagged the $123,700 transfer she had made as suspicious activity with my private banking contact at Commonwealth Trust. I had known him since my days consulting on internal fraud cases, and I didn't need to explain much, just that it was urgent and personal. Next, I forwarded a copy of the transaction and supporting documentation to my attorney, Margaret Sloan, a woman as calm and calculating as any I've ever met in my professional life. We'd never discussed this exact scenario, but she had helped me draft the framework years ago when I first began suspecting that not all was well beneath the surface of my marriage. I added one line to the email, nothing more. Please initiate the divorce proceedings and request an immediate injunction on shared assets. It felt strange how matter-of-fact it all was. There was no dramatic music, no tearful confrontation, just a man activating what he had prepared in silence, while his world quietly collapsed. When I finally called my mother later that morning and told her what had happened, she didn't gasp or ask if I was okay. Instead, there was a long pause, and then a gentle, weary sigh. "Raymond, I'm sorry," she said, "but I can't say I didn't see this coming." "What are you going to do now?" I didn't hesitate. "What I've spent years preparing to do," I told her. "I'm going to protect what's mine." That afternoon, as her calls began to flood my phone, first with confused concern, then with frantic demands, I ignored them. The woman who had once kissed me goodnight now wanted answers, but I had none to give. The damage had already been done. I was no longer in the business of rescuing her from the consequences she had so deliberately courted. She had made her move, and now mine had begun. Later that evening, I drove to the storage unit she had listed in the text. I entered the code she'd sent with clinical detachment, pulled open the metal door, and stood staring at 2 boxes labeled with my name in her handwriting: neat, practiced, impersonal. Inside were some clothes, my laptop, a few items she hadn't bothered to toss or sell. But the things that mattered, the framed photos of my father, the watch he left me when he passed, the books I had collected over a lifetime, were gone. That was the moment something hardened in me. Until then, I had been operating on strategy and habit, managing the fallout like a case file. But staring into that empty unit, I felt the full weight of what she had done. Not just the financial betrayal or the emotional cruelty, but the erasure. She hadn't just left. She had tried to rewrite my life without me in it. And so as I sat in my truck outside that cold metal box, I opened my laptop and began tracing her trail. Not out of revenge, not yet, but because something deeper than anger had taken hold. I wasn't going to let this be the end of my story. I was going to write the next chapter myself, and this time, every move would be mine. Back at the hotel that evening, I sat at the small desk by the window, the city lights of Springfield dimming into a quiet haze beyond the glass, and I began doing what I did best, following money trails. The man Vanessa had been tagging on her increasingly curated social media posts, the one with the permanent tan, faux philosophical captions, and carefully angled gym selfies, was named Trent Dawson. She had referred to him once as just a business connection, though by now I knew exactly what kind of business they were conducting. Using investigator-grade databases still available to me through my old professional license, I began to dig. It didn't take long to confirm what I had suspected. Trent was not the successful entrepreneur he pretended to be, but a man whose entire operation was built on illusion. His gym chain, Pulse Method Wellness, looked polished on the outside, sleek branding, staged testimonials, upscale workout equipment. But beneath that facade lay a tangle of debt, over-leveraged assets, and credit cards pushed to the brink. His business wasn't thriving, it was hemorrhaging. What truly caught my attention, however, wasn't just the financial instability. It was the fact that 2 months before Vanessa walked out on me, she had co-signed on a vehicle loan with Trent, a mid-range SUV registered in both their names. The date on the paperwork matched one of her retreat weekends. I traced more documents and found at least 3 business credit lines linked to a shell company owned by Trent, with payments coming directly from accounts bearing Vanessa's name. Accounts which in turn had been funded by small, frequent withdrawals from our joint savings, camouflaged as marketing expenses and studio development fees. The deeper I looked, the clearer the picture became. She hadn't just stolen from me. She had been using our shared wealth to bankroll a man who had nothing of his own, someone who saw her not as a partner but as a bridge out of his financial quicksand. My stomach turned not out of jealousy but disbelief at how methodically she had orchestrated this. But then came the discovery that shifted everything. Trent had applied for a commercial equipment loan totaling $165,000, using high-end fitness machines as collateral. The application had been approved in part because of a co-signer. Vanessa, again. Only this time, the document listed her as Vanessa Whitaker, spouse, jointly responsible. That single phrase changed everything. Without my knowledge, and certainly without my consent, she had used my name, my status as her legal husband, to secure more favorable loan terms. She'd essentially mortgaged my reputation to cover a failing business, assuming I would never notice or never fight back. It was then that I knew this was no longer just a divorce or a betrayal. It was fraud. Not metaphorically, not emotionally, legally, unequivocally, criminal fraud. And that gave me leverage. Real leverage. The next morning I visited my brother Martin, a digital forensics analyst with whom I'd collaborated on several high-profile cases in our earlier years. When I laid out the documents, bank transfers, and loan agreements, his brow furrowed deeper with each new page. "She didn't just leave you," he muttered. "She tried to erase you while putting your name on her wreckage." We spent hours tracing every transaction, cross-referencing LLC registrations, and connecting bank activity to shared assets. By mid-afternoon, we had a comprehensive package of evidence, including proof that several pieces of equipment purchased under Trent's gym expansion had been secured using marital assets as the foundation for his funding. Even more damning were the payments Vanessa had authorized from our joint account, over $82,000 in total, toward a business entity that was never once disclosed to me. That evening, I met with Margaret again. I handed her the file and watched her eyes narrow with quiet satisfaction as she turned each page. "We'll file for emergency asset protection in the morning," she said. "There's enough here to freeze everything until a full investigation is conducted." And just like that, the balance of power shifted. Vanessa had made her move, assuming I'd fold, that I'd crumble under the weight of her abandonment and the narrative she'd already begun spinning among our friends. That I was cold, detached, consumed by work. What she hadn't counted on was that the man she left behind wasn't broken. He was prepared. By the time Trent's Gym opened its doors that Monday, a court order had been issued to freeze all shared assets, including those used as co-signed guarantees. The banks began calling, and the calls weren't friendly. I didn't say a word to either of them, not yet. I had no interest in vengeance through chaos. My strategy was precision, and the next step was already underway. By the time the messages from Vanessa shifted from cold detachment to full-blown panic, I had already stepped beyond the reach of her manipulation. At first she called, her voice tight with artificial concern. "Raymond, something's wrong with the bank. I can't access anything." I let the call ring out. Then came the texts, each more frantic than the last. Questions bleeding into demands. "What did you do?" "The accounts are frozen and call me now." I didn't answer. There was nothing left to explain and no reason to soothe the very person who had orchestrated my ruin behind a carefully curated smile. That afternoon I drove across town to a building that knew nothing of yoga mats and detox shakes. A concrete office complex housing my legal counsel, where professionalism replaced pretense. While Margaret and her team reviewed the latest correspondence from Vanessa's newly retained attorney, a thinly veiled threat accusing me of financial hostility, I received a notification from the front desk. "Your wife is here," the receptionist said, her voice hesitant. "She's very insistent." I stood, adjusted my jacket, and walked toward the lobby, preparing not for a fight, but for closure. Vanessa stood by the glass doors, her usual effortless poise cracking at the edges. She wore designer sunglasses perched in her hair, yoga pants that cost more than my monthly utilities, and a rehearsed expression that tried for charm but couldn't hide the desperation flickering beneath. As soon as she saw me, her voice rose. Cheerful, performative, too loud for the space. "Ray, I think there's been a huge mistake with the bank. Our accounts are all locked." I walked closer, voice low and steady. "It's not a mistake. You made unauthorized transfers. The bank flagged them as fraud." Her smile faltered, her posture stiffened. "But it was our joint account. I'm your wife." I met her gaze, unwavering. "You're my soon-to-be ex-wife who emptied our savings while telling me you'd found someone better. That's textbook financial misconduct." She glanced around nervously, aware now of the staff watching from behind reception. Her tone dropped to a hiss. "You can't do this to me. I've already committed to a lease, and Trent, he needs—" "Yes," I interrupted, calm as ever. "I know all about Trent, the car, the loans, the equipment lease. I've seen the documents." Her face drained of color. "You're spying on me." "I'm protecting myself from fraud," I said simply, "and just so we're clear, those loans you co-signed, they're secured by marital assets, which means now that we're divorcing, the banks are calling those debts due, immediately." She took a step back, mouth slightly open, speechless for a rare moment. "I deserve half of everything," she whispered, almost pleading. I nodded, but not out of agreement. "Half of what you can prove is ours, but you seem to be under the impression that our joint accounts were all there was." She blinked, confusion and fear mingling behind her eyes. "What are you talking about?" "You'll find out in discovery," I said, then turned and walked back to the conference room. Later that day, her lawyer sent a flurry of emails demanding full disclosure of my finances and threatening to expose supposed irregularities in my accounting work. The irony would have been amusing if it weren't so pathetic. I forwarded the message to Margaret with 2 words: proceed accordingly. Within 48 hours, Margaret's team had filed motions to protect every asset Vanessa had touched or tried to touch. The financial institutions that had once issued Trent's lines of credit were now reversing course, their tone less accommodating and far more aggressive. I didn't need to lift a finger. The collapse had already begun. By the end of the week, Vanessa wasn't just calling me anymore. She was rallying mutual friends, spinning a narrative where I was bitter, controlling, vindictive. She leaned on sympathy, suggesting I was having some sort of midlife breakdown, that she had simply wanted a fresh start and I was punishing her for it. No one seemed to ask why she had drained our accounts or co-signed business loans with a man she had barely known. They heard her story, and because she cried, they believed it. I didn't argue, I didn't explain. I let the silence speak because silence, when backed by truth, is a powerful weapon. 3 days later, Margaret called with news that confirmed everything we had built was working. "The forensic review is complete," she said. "Vanessa's been funneling money from your joint account into Trent's business for over a year. Small transfers, steadily increasing. The total now exceeds $80,000. I exhaled slowly, not out of surprise but a kind of resignation. I had known it, felt it in my bones. But now we had proof. Not just betrayal, but premeditated financial deceit. Not just emotional infidelity, but calculated theft. My marriage had ended long before her message arrived. She had just been waiting for the right moment to cash out. And yet the final blow hadn't landed, at least not for her. That came in the form of a certified letter from the district attorney's office, triggered by the bank's fraud investigation and our legal filings. Vanessa hadn't just co-signed on a loan using marital status. She had forged my name on at least 2 of the contracts tied to Trent's expansion, a felony offense in our state. At mediation, when the terms of settlement were presented, she looked hollow, still dressed impeccably, still trying to maintain the image, but now visibly unraveling beneath the weight of consequences. Her lawyer attempted negotiation, but the facts were immovable. Sign the agreement, we offered, and I'd withhold statements that could push this from civil to criminal. Deny it, and the full extent of the charges would be pursued, along with restitution and potential jail time. She signed. As we left the room, she reached for my arm, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never thought you'd fight back." I looked at her one last time, not with anger or triumph, but clarity. "That was your mistake," I said. "You assumed silence meant weakness. It meant I was waiting." And then I walked away for good. And a month after the settlement was signed and the last legal document sealed away in a beige folder I hoped never to open again, I left the hotel that had become my temporary refuge and moved into a modest house just east of downtown Springfield. It wasn't grand, and that was precisely the point. A 2-bedroom craftsman with weathered floorboards, original trim, and a backyard that needed more work than I had tools for. But it felt honest, and after the last few years of curated illusion, that was exactly what I needed. Most evenings I'd find myself on the porch with a cup of black coffee or a glass of bourbon, watching the sun fade behind the treetops while kids played in yards nearby, and neighbors waved as they walked their dogs. There was a stillness here, not the kind that echoes with loneliness, but the kind that invites reflection. In that quiet, I began to unpack the emotional weight I'd carried through the chaos. Years of being unseen in my own marriage, of questioning my instincts, of compromising until there was nothing left to protect but my dignity. Through the grapevine, I heard that Vanessa had moved to Boulder, chasing a new beginning she was already marketing online as a soul transformation. Her feed was filled with mountaintop poses and vague quotes about forgiveness and freedom, but never once did she mention the storm she left behind. Trent's gym, unsurprisingly, had been sold to a chain for pennies on the dollar, and rumor had it he'd relocated to Florida to expand his brand. Though based on the financial wreckage we'd unearthed, he was more likely running from creditors than building anything new. My brother Martin stopped by most weekends to help with the repairs, replacing window panes, resealing the deck, sometimes just sitting in silence while we worked through the rhythm of rebuilding. One Saturday, as we stood in the kitchen measuring for new cabinets, he glanced over and asked, "Ever hear from her?" I shook my head, not out of bitterness, but peace. "No," I said. "And I don't expect to." He nodded, and we went back to the task at hand. The air between us filled not with grief, but quiet understanding. I suppose I could have pursued more, filed additional charges, pushed for restitution, dragged every last thread of her betrayal into the public light. Legally, I would have won, but spiritually, I had already won the moment I stopped reacting and started choosing. I didn't need her to lose everything. I only needed to reclaim myself. One crisp morning, I called my office and let them know I'd be taking some time off, not because I was broken or burned out, but because I was finally free. I packed up the old Ford pickup, filled a thermos, and headed north toward a cabin in Minnesota. I hadn't visited since before my father passed. No itinerary, no expectations, just the road, a fishing pole, and the sound of my breath, unburdened for the first time in years. As I crossed the state line and the trees grew thicker along the roadside, I realized that closure doesn't always arrive with a bang or a breakdown. Sometimes it's as quiet as a man driving alone through the pines, no longer haunted by the question, why didn't I see it sooner? Because deep down, I always had. And that's what saved me. Not revenge, not rage, but the simple choice to be ready when the moment came. Now, if you've been through something like this or you're standing on the edge of your own storm, know this. It's not weakness to be kind, and it's not failure to walk away. Justice doesn't always wear armor. Sometimes it wears work gloves and comes in the form of a second chance you build with your own two hands. If this story resonated with you, I hope you'll subscribe for more real stories of resilience and redemption. Share it with someone who needs to hear. You are not alone, and it's never too late to protect what's yours.